to thank the scope and scale and breadth of people and human work and ingenuity that have brought us together. Right now, for instance, as I speak, thanks to decades of work by information technologists and researchers, my voice and image is broken down into data packets or small data files that travel roughly 2/3 the speed of light. Then my router uses a transmission control protocol dancing with an internet protocol to send those packets to you, one of the 4.7 billion people who have internet access around the world. Your packets move through your modem router and are reassembled on your screen, creating the images and the voice you hear there. The scope and scale of researchers, utility line workers, cooks, and cleaners supporting the offices and work sites in each case to make all this happen is absolutely dizzying. And that is merely the background infrastructure that enables our connectivity. Of course, those connections flourish and fail on top of historic inequities. And we will consider those interactions and how they affect our own work in a moment. But before getting there, I want to stay with the theme of Thanksgiving for these connections, innovations, and insights to bring us together. I'll just pause here to say that the basic structure of my presentation this evening is some big themes about community-based global learning and whether it can be decolonial practice. And wondering, do they apply to you and your context and your work? Asking that question. Sharing a couple of related resources, and then returning to the questions. Do these themes apply to you, and what discussion might we have? So I'll depend on Dr. Zaman to facilitate the discussion, and I'm flexible on the timing there at the end. So within weeks after COVID shut down the United States, and really in many cases before that occurred, scientists were drawing on the insights of their international community of collaboration to make progress together. This is from a New York Times article published on April 1st, 2020. It reads in part, normal imperatives like academic credit have been set aside. Online repositories make studies available months ahead of journals. Researchers have identified and shared hundreds of viral genome sequences. More than 200 clinical trials have been launched, bringing together hospitals and laboratories around the globe. And then there's a quote from a scientist based in Italy, Dr. Francesco Perrone. He says, I never hear scientists, true scientists, good quality scientists, speak in terms of nationality. My nation, your nation, my language, your language, my geographic location, your geographic location. This is something that is really distant from true top-level scientists. And here again, while we have seen extraordinary cooperation, we also know that vaccine access and distribution is profoundly unequal, just like the world we inhabit together. What does all of this have to do with community-based global learning? Well, first, we are aligned with the values and the ethos that Dr. Perrone suggests are embraced by true, good, quality scientists. That is, shared work, shared visions, shared cooperation and community are more important than national borders and the national identities that have been foisted upon us through colonial processes. Person-to-person global collaboration helps us move beyond the limited political imagination of a world cut into so many national pieces. The core commitment here is thinking as people first, national citizens second, and committing to the sacred value of all human life. Second, much of the work in community-based global learning or service learning leads to open access resources, typically not at the scale that we see in COVID research, but I want to humbly suggest that creating resources that are open to the public is an important, common, yet radical move within engaged learning. I'm a big fan of a project connected to my home campus here at Haverford College, the Teach It Project. That initiative is focused on creating a dictionary desired by speakers of Chachula Valley Zapotec, an indigenous language with nearly 500,000 speakers. The dictionary is open access through our library system's digital humanities work. Open access resources move our work from the colonial or Western emphasis on control over and ownership of, and toward an understanding of resources more rooted in Robin Wall Kimmerer's conception of indigenous gift economy. That is, things have value according to how much they are well utilized, how they are shared and put to purpose. I want to hold up these two things. the sacred value of all human life, and ensuring open access resources as decolonizing moves. Whoa, big term, big idea. Do I really have the right to suggest something is decolonizing? I'm not sure, but I do think it's my job to try to identify practices and processes that reimagine possibility rather than reinscribing old inequities. And let's face it, a lot of the work of conventional higher education reinscribes old inequities. I'm talking about defining institutional quality by how many people institutions exclude, rather than the breadth and diversity of people they include and empower, along with many other processes and patterns. Of course, I'm also talking about standard civic education and status quo approaches to publication and knowledge mobilization. When we behave in new ways, we create new possibilities. The scholar Wayne Yang, writing as LaPaperson, has helped me along with this. And a third university is possible. Yang writes of struggling between decolonizing desires and our very own identities, which of course bear the marks of colonial upbringings, colonial educations, and inevitably colonial imaginations. And yet we yearn for something more. So LaPaperson writes, my position is impossible, a colonialist byproduct of empire with decolonizing desires. As a colonialist scrap, I desire against the assemblage that made me. What does it mean to struggle against this assemblage? The assemblage, structures, and assumptions of coloniality. One extraordinarily helpful move LaPaperson makes is to differentiate between colonial technologies and colonial identities. Colonial identities make whiteness colonial, exclude indigeneity, and enslave Blackness. And the technologies of colonization have extraordinary and disturbing overlap with these identities. But the process of colonization, the technologies are not the same as the identities. I'm talking about the technologies of control, ownership, enslavement, and exploitation. These are processes. Property law is a set of colonial technologies. By extension, so is intellectual property law, the apparatus that upholds so much of our conception of invention in the worldview we call the modern West. We see LaPaperson wrestling with his own positionality within the colonial university apparatus. And as he writes, a recognition of impossibility means to theorize contingently. That is, my thinking is temporary. My right to think aloud is contingent on the apparatus of legitimated colonial knowledge production that ought to be abolished. Theorizing contingently is to commit to analyses that make space for indigenous sovereign work. What might it mean to make space for indigenous sovereign work? I mentioned my colleague working with the Zapotec language dictionary above. Here is one of her partners in this work, Moises Garcia Guzman. Before they met, Moises was putting videos about Zapotec language onto YouTube, hoping to meet a linguist one day. That day eventually came, and now we dedicate library resources to an initiative that amplifies and codifies indigenous language activists' desires. This is another person I admire, Jean Whitehorse. Jean was active in the American Indian movement in the United States, even being present at that movement's occupation of Alcatraz. Jean often shares her story publicly, and part of that includes being involuntarily sterilized in a US government Bureau of Indian Affairs hospital. I've been fortunate to work with university and nonprofit innovations that recognize Jean's living knowledge, her commitment to sharing her story as a form of activism, and to be able to center her stories in classrooms and allow students to learn in accredited ways through being with Jean and her community between the four mountains that the Dene community recognizes as sacred space. That sacred space includes Chaco Canyon, pictured on the right, one of the most beautiful parts of the United States, and a place with very little light pollution, often blessed with clear views of the Milky Way. I include that photo here as a reminder always that emplaced and experiential learning goes well beyond these incredibly important human interactions and extends to include awe and reverence. I always fondly remember the Dene elder who said to me, referring to students from the East Coast of the United States, "Can you believe that some of them have never seen the Milky Way?" It may not always be specifically or especially indigenous voices that receive intentional space. In Decolonizing Ethnography, Alonso Bejarano Lopez Juarez, Milangos Garcia, and Goldstein cite Walsh in declaring that decolonized scholarship is intellectual production not aimed at individual accomplishment or limited to the confines of the academy, but rather at the shared need to confront the colonial racist structures, systems, and institutions of society through a collective praxis. Decolonizing efforts not only work to disentangle learning and knowledge development from the colonial conception of individual ownership, but also envision an alternative understanding of knowledge development. Decolonized work, they say, requires the involvement of all parties in the research process, a breaking down of the boundaries between academia and the world, and a full recognition of so-called research subjects as thinkers and researchers in their own right. And finally, decolonizing academic spaces is not merely about why we should engage in knowledge production or how that process should occur. At a fundamental level, it reconsiders why we connect. South African scholar Samia Chasey suggests decolonization, quoting Chasey, is both an attitude and a practice aimed at rehumanizing the world. From the perspective of the global South, and in the words of Dilip Menon, an invitation to imagine the world afresh. As such, it can be used as a tool to address the imbalanced nature of North-South partnerships. As civic actors and change agents within evolving understandings of the academy, it is incumbent upon us to express systematic methodologies for better understanding the roles of personal identity, community wisdom, and living knowledges within and among other sources of knowledge. These questions also implicate the reigning economic model of higher education, moving us to see opportunities to act upon financial systems rather than just critiquing them. And I'm quoting LaPaperson there again, act upon financial systems rather than just critiquing them. I didn't explicitly mention it when I shared the story of working with Jean Whitehorse, but when I mention recognition, I advocate for remuneration to follow closely behind. This commitment to critiquing and changing the economic model of higher education and its partnerships to remunerate knowledge where it lives is at the heart of fair trade learning, an approach to ethical partnerships that I have helped develop and steward. I've mentioned a couple of decolonizing moves now, and I hope you're thinking about the ways these kinds of trends, desires, or actions show up in your work, because that's what I'm curious about and would love to hear about in a few minutes. Most of this thinking I've shared with you tonight built up over the last 20 years, and so much of it through conversation with a friend and co-author many of you know, Richard Kiley, who I believe is here tonight. But I also have to tell you that the pandemic kind of supercharged and catalyzed some of my own thinking, along with the actions and outputs of the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative. And that catalyzation occurred in large part because we, and here I'm just especially talking about the political and social culture of the United States, we were caught so flat-footed by a pandemic that across political affiliations and sectors, we had many, many warnings about. All I could conclude was that due to our especially limited imaginations, we see poorly. We imagine independence where interdependence is the deeper truth. 2020 reclarified interdependence of people and our ancestors through structural racism, of people and the environment through wildflowers, and of people and animals through COVID-19. And so in May and June of 2020, through collaboration with more than 20 higher education institutions and civil society organizations, the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative put together online open access resources that advance such a civics of interdependence. Since that time, more than a dozen institutions of higher learning and community organizations have utilized the pages in educational environments with several hundred students. The resources are intentionally open access, comprising a growing collection of more than 24 distinct learning modules. They comprise an invitation to learn together in networked communities. The lens of interdependence concretizes the global through the specificity of the local. Rather than focusing attention on global government structures that often seem far away and abstract, it invites learners to think from their own identities, experiences, and spaces of civic action, and influence, drawing connections between those localized insights to then illuminate rooted understandings of global challenges, goals, and governance structures. By inviting learners into dialogue with key concepts, the pages collectively enact the insights of embracing student strengths and cultural wealth and recognizing community-based assets and desires. What we learned from using the toolkit over the last year should not be surprising, but it is, I think, beautiful. And the insight is simply that the ongoing social scientific debate about whether or where social change can occur at personal or structural dimensions is simply too dichotomous. In the articulation of personal structural tension, we often miss the critical conveyance. Community. Community bridges and builds the between personal and structural change. Community is a nest of relationships where ideas are socialized, where dreams are hatched and sketched into plans, where resources are pooled, where study occurs, where dialogue creates new meaning, new knowledge, and new opportunity. The community may be a place or it may overlap with place. We're a community here tonight, and you will have created community across your institutions over time. It gives us a chance to think through ideas together. The most essential element is meaningful relationship and connection. That is one of the themes in the toolkit too. It is not either or, it is within and among. It is interdependence. We don't get to choose our preferred theory. We who work in and among this world have to step forward, experimenting, hacking systems a bit, and also recognizing the good part of those systems we have. I am, again, grateful to be in conversation with you today, and I'm interested in the ways in which we continue to empower some of the best forms of international science, technology, and collaboration, while decolonizing the worst forms, growing toward new kinds of possibilities, perhaps not fully imagined yet, together. So now, with the time that we have together, I'd like to open up the room a bit, see what kinds of wisdom and knowledge are in the room. I know with absolute confidence that there's more wisdom in the Zoom room than there will ever be in my brain. So I'm curious if you see connections with the 5 themes that I've identified above. And I'll review them, thinking about the ways in which pedagogy might be a decolonizing move by focusing on interdependence or critical global citizenship. I've been using the language of interdependence, but it really grows from critical global citizenship. It centers relationships, the sacredness of all people, and/or things as essential commitments and lenses through which to consider obligations and ethical actions. It thinks beyond the state to a kind of being and relationship. Open access and public scholarship embraces an understanding of knowledge, more rooted in the gift economy, where something is valuable according to how much it is shared and utilized. Participatory and engaged methodologies recognize knowledges live many places and are discerned through disparate processes, including political practice and advocacy. Participatory and engaged methodologies also call on academic workers to facilitate the emergence of praxis-informed, experiential, lived knowledges among diverse stakeholders, sharing new insights to forward shared desires. Finally, a decolonizing move is restructuring the political economy of engaged learning, understanding that individuals with unique living knowledge deserve just remuneration for sharing their insights and time. So I'd love to take a couple moments for you to choose one of these decolonizing moves I mentioned. I see, I'm looking back to the chat here. Curious, yep, people participated a bit more. So it's just taking a little bit of time in the last case. So I'll give a little bit of time here, and Dr. Zaman, I'll defer to you on process as well. But I'm curious if people see connections between their own work and these decolonizing moves. And if there are things you could hold up that show a way that you're doing something that relates to one of these kinds of things. or identify a move that you'd like to make or an opportunity that you see in the work that you take up. And I'm just going to take a couple of moments to pause and ask everyone to reflect on that question, and write in any thoughts you have to share about ways that your own work intersects with these kinds of themes or things that attract you about the themes, and drop those into the chat. And then we can also, I'll defer to Dr. Zaman for how we move forward with questions. I see he's chatting that he's made a word cloud as well. So I think he's already active and engaged. And I'll pause now and say thank you again for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you, Eric. We have one question currently from Dr. Roger Harris. And before moving out also to that, your first question at the beginning of the presentation, we got the responses and I created a word cloud from that. If you want me to display, you can let me know anytime. I can display that one. But let's go back to the Dr. Roger Harris question first. Do you think the SDG increased the relevance of service learning?
Thanks for that question. It's quite relevant to some of the things I was referring to. And in my presentation this evening, I was able to grab a couple of different pieces, but not the full story. One of those pieces was that interdependence toolkit that I mentioned, and really reviewing how that toolkit's been used over the last year. One of the SDGs are a part of that toolkit. And the toolkit, what it really does, I think, is help show people universal ideas and universalizing ideals like SDGs or like human dignity, and then really ask reflective questions that ask people to think about themselves and their own civic spaces and civic actions and how they relate. And what we did see in that interaction was a really strong rootedness, and using the SDGs helped people think comparatively and systematically. So we worked with a community college population in Providence, Rhode Island, where they really took SDGs and used them to apply for grants and then integrate with some local education. And also seeing the SDGs used comparatively in a city like Philadelphia, actually. Philadelphia has been bragging recently about decreasing rates of incarceration, which is a good thing. But if we don't have comparative data, people might not realize that we're still one of the most incarcerated populations in the world. So SDGs are vitally important, and I do think there's a great deal of opportunity to help people understand their context in that comparative sense. And they make sense when they're deeply rooted in reflection questions that get people to bring them down the ground. Otherwise, they can seem too distant.
Thank you for that. So, Crux, yes, what we can get from your answer or can convey the message that you are conveying is that if the SDGs discussion is deeply rooted in and it is more participatory with service learning, it will be more meaningful somehow. The second question is again from Roger, and this is somehow very interesting one, which we have always talked about in this part of the world, and especially in the Global Citizenship Program also, that how service learning is giving a space or creating a space for mutual learning and convergence of knowledge systems. Not only in practice, but we would also like to have your views on that how service learning can really bring the indigenous knowledge to the classrooms. If you can share some examples of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the, I hope came across in my presentation, and something I've really been leaning into more and more is, to the extent possible, leaving dichotomies behind. And the reification of concepts like we do in Western thought seems to get us in trouble again and again. So indigenous and to the extent that there's indigenous knowledge on the one hand and Western scientific or human rights knowledge on the other, to the extent that that may exist, they have such wonderful assets and insights to contribute to one another. And we don't need to leave behind absolutely either one to move forward as a, species among an ecology that's trying to figure out how to co-create just, inclusive, sustainable communities. Drawing on indigenous wisdom to better understand more about sustainability and more about ecosystem, and more about finding ways not to dichotomize all the time is wonderful. And as is the gift of thinking through a co-created frame about human rights and sustainability that is intentionally unfinished and intentionally adaptive. These things can grow together.
Okay, so there are two more questions. One is from Evia. As of now, do you think these decolonizing moves have been used or applied in SL? I think you have a few examples of that already. You shared it about that. If you want to add anything to that, otherwise then we move to Shorna's question.
Well, I'll just say briefly, there are a couple examples I share. I think the theme for me is I look for community desire driven questions, scholarly application, and outputs that matter for communities, outputs that were desired by communities. So another project that I've been a fan of is there's an activist group in Guatemala that's working hard at restorative justice in relation to the civil war that went on for many years there. And they have an archive they were aiming to organize, and they needed historians in the library system. And coming from their desires and their actions, it's the sort of model of experts on tap, not on top. So then from their desires, aligning faculty capacities and student actions to create a library system that's open access around that particular issue area. That's the kind of thing I look for. And I'm reading the question from Shorna here.
Yes, it's a long one. So you want me to read or? Maybe for the participant, I just read. Shorna has asked that, can you speak to best practices for open access and public scholarship and how it relates to the gift economy? We have seen much more of this with COVID pandemic and sharing and collaborating in the science realm and across university and other sectors. Do you think this will become more common?
Right. I certainly hope it will become more common. And it's interesting on the best practices front. I'll say I do have a syllabus I want to go back to from a course, which I'd be happy to share. But it really took examples across different fields of scholars' commitments to open access work and showed some examples. I think in the sciences, the physical sciences, I know this is resisted maybe more so than some other spaces. I'm seeing a lot of openings. I have to admit, well, actually experimentation is a good thing. So there's so many different approaches to how to make this possible. I mean, some journals are charging institutions for something to be open access. Some scholars are doing more work where they're just putting things on Medium or the internet or et cetera. How to sustain open access hasn't quite been figured out. But I guess I'll go back to Robin Wall Kimmerer's, really appreciate Robin Wall Kimmerer. And I don't know if you come across her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, it's got a chapter on the gift economy within it. And it's almost like there's some kind of hope in there that if if something is shared and it is truly useful, the benefits will return to the sharer, right, over time. I don't know that's how we approach conventional peer-reviewed scholarship.
Thank you very much, Eric. Is there any more question? We have 2 to 3 more minutes. Yeah, and would you like me to share the word cloud with you if you want to see the feedback?
Sure.
The first question. Okay, let me share the word cloud with you. Okay, so this is the word cloud, and we can see that in response, many people are talking about community, learning.
Eric, I don't think it's showing yet, maybe.
Okay. Is it taking time?
Can others see it? It might just be me. I'm not
Okay,
sure if anyone.
I'm going to stop it and I'm going to share it again.
It was because I had the share, so I just ended that.
Okay, there it is. It's
Okay.
visible now, sorry.
Yes. So the response is about community, learning, benefits, and knowledge. These are some of the words which are really coming out in response to the question that you have asked. There is also about impact. Relationship is still very small in these whole cases, and this diversity or difference of opinion is also there. So over to you, Eric, if you want to have any comments on that.
Well, sorry, now I've lost the screen as well. Yeah, I will just briefly say, and then as we're getting near the end of time, I'll close up here in a moment. But it's wonderful to hear a focus on impact. And I think it goes back to Evia, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, or if I'm not, I apologize. But Evia Veno's question about decolonizing noobs. I draw a lot on Eve Tuck to think about desire-based collaboration. And I think if we are, as academics or practitioner scholars, leading from the desires articulated by historically marginalized communities and populations, and applying skills, knowledge, and resources in a way that is co-creative with those desires and with those people, we get outputs and impacts that can be incredibly diverse, because a community might want an archive, or a community might want a water system, a community might want an educational program, and many different people and communities will want different things. But if we start with desires that are really community driven and work to stay in alignment on tap and not on top, and work together, I think we'll see that great diversity of impact in positive ways. And I'm going to try to share my screen again, Tariq. I don't know. Is that sharing? Okay. So as I close, I just wanted to thank the conference organizers again. I appreciate being here. Appreciate the miracle of connecting around the world. And to mention, I should mention what the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative is. We're a network of institutions, organizations, individuals that are really fundamentally dedicated to advancing ethical, critical, and aspirationally decolonial community-based learning and research. So there's lots of opportunities to be involved if you're ever interested. And I'll make sure that these slides, in fact, I'm going to share these slides in the chat in just a second so that everyone has the links if they're interested in them. But we're on social media as well, if anyone wants to stay in contact or in touch. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak and to be here.